Preface Andrea Smith before the publication of The Revolution Will Not Be Funded. Beyond the non-profit industrial complex, critiques of the non-profit system had been circulating for years. Yet, there seemed to be little thought that we would engage in a social justice organizing system outside the non-profit system. This was particularly true in the anti-violence movement where, as Beth Ritchie notes in her volume Arrested Justice, the anti-violence movement has ceased to be a movement and has become a network of primarily state-funded agencies. INCITE, organized in 2000 in response to state co-optation of the anti-violence movement. As part of its statement of principles, it declared that it would not take funding from state agencies. As the anti-violence movement's imbrication with the state had led this movement to be invested in the criminal justice system and its attendant prison industrial complex, INCITE, was clear that there needed to be an anti-violence movement that was not invested in carceral feminism and was independent of state funding. Preface Andrea Smith before the publication of The Revolution Will Not Be Funded. Beyond the non-profit industrial complex, critiques of the non-profit system had been circulating for years. Yet, there seemed to be little thought that we would engage in a social justice organizing system outside the non-profit system. This was particularly true in the anti-violence movement where, as Beth Ritchie notes in her volume Arrested Justice, the anti-violence movement has ceased to be a movement and has become a network of primarily state-funded agencies. INCITE, organized in 2000 in response to state co-optation of the anti-violence movement. As part of its statement of principles, it declared that it would not take funding from state agencies. As the anti-violence movement's imbrication with the state had led this movement to be invested in the criminal justice system and its attendant prison industrial complex, INCITE, was clear that there needed to be an anti-violence movement that was not invested in carceral feminism and was independent of state funding. Given the strong critique that INCITE had of state funding, it is significant that it had no significant critique of foundation funding. Of course, we would gripe with social justice organizers at conferences about the problems with foundations and grant writing, but we did seem to take foundation funding for granted as a necessary evil. On a trip to India, funded ironically by the Ford Foundation, we had our consciousness raised about the nonprofit system. We met with unfunded organizations that asked us why we thought the system was going to fund any real systemic change. We saw organizations that had access to much fewer resources than did we, and yet this did not stop us from doing amazing organizing. As we began to be more connected to mass movements globally and questioned by participants who asked us, "Do you think the system is really going to fund you to dismantle it?" we began to see the need to think outside the nonprofit system for our organizing work. We then soon discovered that the revolution would not be funded when the Ford Foundation, who had promised us a $100,000 grant and told us we could commit the funds to various projects, suddenly retracted the grant because of our solidarity statement in support of Palestine. We found ourselves in a major financial crisis because the funds had already been committed and we had about 6 weeks to raise $60,000 for our next national conference. And yet we managed to do this. So, we learned on one hand that foundations can indeed control your organizing, and on the other hand, there are other ways to resource movements when we think outside the foundation universe. It was in this context that we organized a conference titled The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, Beyond the Non-Profit Industrial Complex in 2004. From this conference came the anthology that was published by South End Press in 2007. At this conference, we did not have a proposed solution or a strategy for navigating the NPIC. The conference was in fact organized through discussion groups to strategize on how we could best resource our movements and navigate the system. Plenary speakers did not have a uniform position on the NPIC. The aim was to provide discussion and debate. Despite this fact, This book was sometimes misread as a call to quit one's nonprofit job or to refuse to ever write a grant again. However, what has become clear is that this book helped foster movement conversations about the NPIC, and that the NPIC was the tip of a larger iceberg: capitalism. Organizations might give up their nonprofit status, but this did not necessarily improve organizing if they did not challenge the capitalist assumptions behind their work. For instance, one model adopted by some organizations was to rely on volunteer labor by individuals who supported themselves with day jobs. However, not everyone has the same day job. Some day jobs provide more resources and free time than others. If these organizations do not collectivize the resources from these day jobs, then a class structure develops in which those with better day jobs have more opportunities to engage and thus control the organization. In addition, while it is certainly possible to organize without a nonprofit status, it is not really possible to organize outside of capitalism and thus outside of compromise. What seems to be the problem for organizing in the United States anyway is not that there are nonprofits, but that the organizing is often done solely through the nonprofit. In our networks, we found that mass movements in other countries did not necessarily avoid NGOs, foundations, or grant writing. What they did was to develop movements that were funded by their base. If they then wanted to secure a grant for a specific project, they might set up a front nonprofit to get that grant. But that nonprofit would answer to the movement. It was not seen as part of the movement itself. And if that nonprofit became defunded, it would not significantly impact the larger movement that was primarily funded by its base. Thus, it seems the more important question was not whether one should ever get nonprofit status, but what is the most strategic way to use nonprofits so they support movements rather than being thought of as the movement. Thus, for instance, what if we thought of domestic violence shelters and sexual assault agencies not as the anti-violence movement, but as agencies that could potentially support an independent anti-violence movement and perhaps provide a political buffer between the movement and the state? This thinking has deepened the analysis by organizers on how to not just organize beyond the NPIC, but to think more critically about how to organize within the context of capitalism in general. Thus, the call to move beyond the nonprofit industrial complex goes beyond a critique of the system, but instead requires us to think about what modes of organizing we want. There are no easy answers to this question. Thus, this text should be read less as a prescription on the right way to organize and more of an invitation to think about what other possibilities exist that may include elements of, but are not bound by, current modes of organizing. Forward Sania Munshi and Craig Wilsey in this forward. We revisit the history of the nonprofit industrial complex critique, connecting it to emerging analyses of the academic industrial complex, as well as its historical antecedents and critical interventions into the U.S. military and prison systems. Reflecting on the current context of neoliberalism, we also raise some questions about the limits of these critiques to think about what kinds of political responses to injustice we most want and need. Beginning with the first Color of Violence conference in 2000 and continuing with subsequent conferences and publications, INCITE brought into conversation community organizers and advocates, activists, service providers, teachers, and scholars. While differently situated, these various groups find their work shaped in powerful and often constraining ways by what was being called the nonprofit industrial complex. This term signaled what INCITE identified as a system of relationships between the state, the owning classes, foundations, and nonprofit NGO social service and social justice organizations. One, as the critique of the NPIC spread among academic audiences, its analysis was brought to the university setting, launching a nascent critique of the academic industrial complex. To think in terms of an AIC was to ask parallel questions about why we have the form of institutionalized education that we do, and what the role of universities might be in both maintaining status quos and furthering harms caused by capitalism, heteropatriarchy, and white supremacy. The AIC framework brought renewed attention to the role of the academy in directly supporting criminal punishment systems and military-industrial complexes. Two, at the same time, if nonprofits have been essential sites for access to life-saving and sustaining resources, universities have remained important locations for generating critical dissent. In recent years, students and teachers have found that space shrinking and made vulnerable through attacks on critical and ethnic studies programs, centers, and faculty members. the elimination of tenure-track lines and adjunctification of labor, and the cutting of state funds and increased privatization on the backs of students in the form of unbearable debt. Point 3. The nonprofit and the school are two key sites in which neoliberal social and economic reforms are both constituted and contested. These two realms are not distinct but are deeply implicated in one another, often in joint projects of producing for neoliberalism, producing knowledge and producing communities. Considering the nonprofit and the university together offers an opportunity to rethink the relationships between activism and scholarship, as well as a chance to re-theorize neoliberalism from the bottom up, to ask, what are the possibilities for transformative politics given the capacity of neoliberal capital to incorporate, absorb, and/or neutralize demands for social justice? And what can we produce in excess of neoliberalism? Neoliberalism. We understand neoliberalism as the form of capitalism that has dominated transnational economic systems since the early 1970s. As an ideology, neoliberalism is predicated upon the belief that the maximization of social good requires locating all human action in the domain of the market. Accordingly, neoliberal ideology demands governmental non-interference in a market understood to follow a set of natural laws that direct the market toward its continual expansion. This is most commonly expressed in an anti-big government rhetoric that has become, in the United States at least, the baseline from which debates about any social program begin. Despite constant and vehement calls for less and less state involvement in social and economic life, neoliberalism has in fact elicited persistent and intensive governmental action on its behalf. When neoliberalism moves from a set of ideas into practice, it requires an active state to direct the dismantling of social welfare programs, the deregulation of labor and trade, and the protection of the wealth and assets of transnational corporations and a global elite class. Neoliberalism was introduced gradually in the United States, beginning with the fiscal reforms of the 1970s. In the early 1980s, neoliberalism started to become visible in its transformations of the social realm. This took place under the administration of Ronald Reagan and the beginning of the dismantling of the social safety net. Like the reforms of Margaret Thatcher, his counterpart in the United Kingdom, Reagan's reforms relied on violent and oppressive state tactics, such as the mass firing of striking air traffic controllers as a move to crush organized labor, which stood in the way of neoliberalism. The cumulative effects of decades of neoliberal reform have been a massive exacerbation of the inequalities of racial capitalism and its gender divisions of labor. This has resulted in part from the deindustrialization of the U.S. economy and the outsourcing of production jobs overseas. In a racially stratified labor market, the restructuring of these sectors of employment most affected people of color, especially recent immigrants and African Americans. At the same time, the rollback of social welfare programs in particular has targeted the 1960s Great Society expansion of access to social welfare programs to formerly excluded populations of color. 4 women of color have borne the brunt of these reforms, as well as of the mechanisms of surveillance and punishment that have become joined to public assistance access. And if the effects of neoliberalism have been racialized and gendered, accompanying discourses have both exploited and obscured this fact. Feminist scholars including Lisa Lowe and Lisa Duggan have argued that we must account for the ways in which the economic reforms of neoliberalism are mobilized through cultural discourses of race, gender, and sexuality. 5 such analysis points to how the gendered and racialized effects of neoliberalism have been hidden under a cover story that blames people of color for their own impoverished conditions. The most infamous version of this perhaps has been what Patricia Hill Collins labels the controlling image of the welfare queen. 6. The welfare queen narrative drew from a pathologization of black families best represented in the 1965 Moynihan Report, which narrated black families as aberrant failures at heteropatriarchal norms. The report posited this as the source of black poverty. 7. The image of a single black mother living in luxury off welfare payments helped generate white opposition to social welfare programs that in fact primarily benefit white individuals and families. Thus, neoliberal reforms gained populist support through cultural mobilizations of gender, race, and sexuality. Elizabeth Bernstein and Janet Jacobson point out that gender, sexuality, and race have also been mobilized to expand neoliberalism through projects of incorporation. Various feminist and queer scholars have examined the intertwined economic, gendered, and sexual interests that coalesce in corporate campaigns to appropriate seemingly progressive causes such as LGBT rights and the fight against breast cancer, or in the neoliberal state's appropriation of formerly liberationist discourses in fomenting sexual nationalisms, carceral politics, and securitized borders. A. Jamie Peck and Adam Tickle describe the Thatcher-Reagan era as the rollback phase of neoliberalism. 9 By this they mean that in this stage of neoliberal reform, the protections of the social welfare state were actively undone. Of course, this rolling back is not singular or total, but continues in various forms today. Schools and nonprofit organizations continue to be shaped by ongoing cuts to state support for social welfare and education. As noted earlier, as the state has disavowed its responsibility for the health and well-being of its population, nonprofit industries have grown to assume this role, providing essential social and health services. This privatization has not simply entailed a handing over of state monies, as nonprofits must compete for public funds which are made increasingly scarce. At the same time, schools and universities have suffered major withdrawal of public money. This has been one of the greatest rollback successes of neoliberal reform. It has meant the aggressive introduction of private corporate interests and business models into education, seen in everything from corporate-produced curriculum to standardized testing. At primary and secondary levels, this has resulted in the expansion of charter schools. In higher education, this has meant the privatization of universities through corporate sponsorship of programs, centers, and entire schools. Peck and Tickle argue that the rollback phase was followed by a rollout phase in which new programs came to fill the vacuum created by the dismantling of the social welfare state. These new programs primarily have taken the form of social control mechanisms to manage the social unrest and disorder that results from the dismantling of the social safety net in the rollback phase. In the United States, this is represented starkly in the massive expansion of systems of policing and imprisonment. Mechanisms of soft control, which are less obviously coercive and directly violent than imprisonment, have also been rolled out. So while primary and secondary schools have seen the introduction of militarized policing, the privatization of education through skyrocketing tuition has produced a debt burden that acts as a more subtle form of social control. If mass education has always served to socialize students into the labor force, today debt plays a controlling function that limits the already constrained choices of graduates and absorbs what could be politically resistant energies. Nonprofits inherit their soft control function from the social welfare state. In Regulating the Poor, Francis Fox Piven and Richard Cloward argue that social welfare programs in the United States mitigate tensions produced under capitalism by filling in for lack of access to full employment and supplementing inadequate wages and benefits. Piven and Cloward chart how social programs expand in the United States during periods of unrest in order to pacify the population and undermine the revolutionary potential of shared experiences of oppression in capitalism. 1 Degree The INCITE volumes helped show the ways the U.S. nonprofit system may perform that role today, doing the work of the state and keeping in place the status quos of state-sponsored and supported forms of inequality and disenfranchisement. This work also takes the perhaps more insidious form of producing and managing forms of sexual and racial difference that meet the terms and needs of capitalism and the state. With their funding restrictions and a social service model of targeted constituents, nonprofits may reproduce categories of deserving and undeserving along lines of legible and illegible identities in the communities on whose behalf the state calls on them to speak. Beyond the industrial complex, the original industrial complex formulation, the military-industrial complex, was brought to attention by then U.S. President Dwight Eisenhower in 1961. In a speech toward the end of his presidency, Eisenhower issued a warning of the dangers that a profit motive would bring to war, made possible by the newly cemented relationship between the institution of the military and a growing arms industry. Eisenhower's caution extended to the role of the federal government, anticipating its misuse of power in this alliance between the military and the defense industry. He perhaps could not have anticipated how important that warning would prove, or the extent to which U.S. policy would come to be driven by the endless money-making opportunities of the War on Terror. Naomi Klein has termed the current version a disaster capitalism complex, which profits not only from war, but from the political, economic, and environmental destruction it wreaks. The privatization of U.S.-led rebuilding abroad in Iraq illustrates this all too clearly, as does the role that domestic militarism played in post-Katrina reconstruction efforts. Point 12 From its attention to war-making in the context of capitalism, the military-industrial complex critique was then extended to the rapidly growing U.S. prison system. The catastrophic economic effects of neoliberal restructuring in the 1970s, along with government repression of resistance movements in communities of color, set conditions for mass criminalization of Black, Latino, and Indigenous people. Since the 1980s, the growth of the prison system has been sustained by the direct investment of private prison corporations. A wide range of industries gained important footholds in this prison marketplace, from food provision to telephone services to militarized correction officer supplies. Angela Davis helped advance this critique of the prison industrial complex. 14 critiques of the PIC drew attention to the fact that the same corporations providing services inside sell goods and services to those on the outside, as with telecommunications industries. Furthermore, these critiques highlighted the market in goods produced by barely waged prison labor. The active role of private prisons in the expansion of detention facilities after the passage of anti-immigration legislation in 1996, and then again in the post-9/11 period, further illuminated the political and economic alliances between corporations and the state. 15 While continuing to be a vital formation for scholars and activists, the prison industrial complex critique has sometimes been mistakenly taken up as implicating only private prisons, those run directly by corporations under contracts from states, rather than the system of capitalism as a whole. Ruth Wilson Gilmore has argued that even thinking in terms of profit motive is not enough. Rather, in her study of the California prison system, Gilmore shows how what she terms the prison fix takes care of 4 surplus crises for neoliberal capital: surpluses of government capacity, land, finance, and labor. The last point is key, as Gilmore demonstrates how prisons serve to take out of circulation unemployed low-wage workers for whom enough of a reserve already exists. In the terms of our above discussion, this is the direct control that accompanies the soft control of nonprofit and education systems during the dismantling of the social safety net. By turning attention to these crises of surplus, Gilmore shows that prison expansion does not only offer a site for profit-making, but secures the U.S. economy within globalization, putting the surpluses of government capacity, land, and finance to work while making redundant the racialized populations no longer needed in labor markets. In this way, prisons represent not just another industrial complex but a container for capitalism itself. Point 16 When extended to nonprofit organizations and the academy, the industrial complex critique has obviously been incredibly fruitful. Nonetheless, as we further develop and refine the frameworks, we must also consider their limits. In our uses of the industrial complex framework, we must recognize that it cannot explain all that occurs within a nonprofit or educational setting. The logics of the NPIC may structure the work that takes place in any given organization, but it does not fully account for or subsume it. In nonprofits, life-saving resources are redistributed, leadership skills are shared and developed, and people build radical consciousness and community. Universities similarly offer vital places for the development of ideas, selves, and communities. Alongside drudgery and conflict, real joy and love live within these complexes, both in spite of and because of their institutional contexts. Structural critiques, such as the industrial complex model, are important for understanding larger political and economic processes that shape the possibilities for how we live and resist. However, these structures are not monolithic, nor are they fully determining. The NPIC, for example, contains within it many types of nonprofits, including both national and transnational organizations with multi-million-dollar budgets and small, grassroots-funded community-based organizations. Across these scales exist a wide range of kinds of work, political commitments, and resources. It is important that we not collapse these differences even while recognizing a set of shared structural forces and logics. This is especially important as nonprofits themselves are vulnerable to these structural forces. For example, nonprofit organizations continue to feel impacts of the recession in both the increased demands for basic social services as well as the shrinking of government and foundation funding and individual donations. Many small organizations made up of poor and working-class members have dissolved or folded into larger nonprofits. A lack of funding has led such groups to give up vital infrastructure and compensated staff positions, but the work continues through volunteer labor, in members' homes or donated space. 17. Similarly, while all higher education institutions are impacted by neoliberal economic reform, this is not experienced identically at all institutions. Differences in funding cuts exist across types of institutions as well as states and regions. While paying critical attention to differences within the AIC and the NPIC, we also must be cautious not to mistake the individuals in those settings for the institutions themselves. Life within the NPIC and AIC requires constant negotiation of how those complexes constrain and enable transformative work. In those negotiations, individuals are not only shaped by their institutional locations but also push back and shape their organizations, universities, and broader contexts. One way to attend to these dynamics is to consider that most people are positioned within the AIC or the NPIC as workers, and as such find themselves caught between their own exploitation and the promises and pitfalls of their schools and organizations. Workers in nonprofit organizations, like any workers, navigate the demands and restrictions of their jobs and the conditions of their workplaces. Nonprofit workers are often members of the same communities that their organizations address, and as people of color, women, queer and trans people, and immigrants are also targeted and made vulnerable by the same systems of exploitation and oppression that they challenge in their work. To the extent that nonprofit organizations maintain the status quo, these forms of violence, including racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, and ableism, are reproduced internally in these settings. Despite these precarious and exploitative conditions, nonprofit workers do more than simply reproduce the logics and further the harms of the nonprofit industrial complex. The priorities and agendas of nonprofit organizations are often set by workers with political commitments and values that resist the assumptions of the NPIC and subvert or manipulate the nonprofit form to serve radical commitments. This can include centering the most vulnerable or marginalized members of the community through internal structures and mobilizing resources to support this work. Nonprofit workers also educate funders and advocate for policy change, two channels through which they shape the broader conditions within which nonprofits do their work. Such work exceeds service provision or programmatic activities, claiming space and resources for radical and transformative projects. For example, a coalition of queer and trans organizations in New York City, including the Audre Lorde Project and the Sylvia Rivera Law Project, waged a campaign against anti-trans practices at the Human Resources Administration. This coalition was successful in winning a variety of demands, including mandated cultural competency training for HRA workers, developed and led by low-income trans people of color. This effort lasted for 5 years and incorporated a variety of strategies including direct action, political education, and community organizing that built collective power in a city-wide membership base that led the campaign. 18. Another recent example of policy advocacy work driven by community mobilization is the victory gained by the SRLP 12-year campaign for Medicaid to cover trans health care. 19. Within the NPIC, power does not flow in only one top-down direction. Rather, within its constraints, the nonprofit can be a vital site from which a great range of workers, activists, advocates, and community members collaboratively transform the conditions of everyday life. Moving to the AIC, we similarly need to foreground an understanding of the university as a workplace setting. As workers, faculty face sped-up demands in terms of teaching loads, class sizes, and publishing, all within increasingly precarious conditions, as the majority of faculty jobs are converted to non-tenure track contract and adjunct positions. As in the NPIC, this workplace setting is organized through exploitative hierarchies of race, class, and gender. For example, women of color carry a disproportionate burden of administrative and student support work while also facing structurally produced devaluation of that labor, as manifested in everything from student evaluations to tenure denials. 2 degrees. Finally, Just as we do not want to mistake the nonprofit worker for the institution itself, the AIC critique must grapple with the role of academics as teachers who hold and reproduce space for political development in their classrooms while also offering support and mentorship to the political activities of students on campus. In recent years, teachers, students, and parents have drawn necessary critical attention to the impact of standardized testing and assessment on teaching and learning. 21 Their organized resistance has galvanized widespread support that must be extended to university settings, especially community college and other public institutions, which increasingly face similar neoliberal restructuring. Finally, while bringing nuance and complexity to our understandings of what happens within the NPIC and AIC, we also must think about the ultimate political aims of these critiques. Critiques of the military and prison industrial complexes have led to the articulation of abolitionist politics. In assessing U.S. military and prison regimes, scholars and activists seek to map their operations in order to dismantle these two sites of violent oppression. Envisioning a world without war and without cages moves us from critique to building alternative possibilities today. Are we similarly calling for the abolition of nonprofits and universities? Some of us may answer that with a yes. And as with the military and prison, they may be irrecuperable through reform. But here we want to distinguish between the institutional form and the content and purpose of activities within those settings, such as those outlined above. There is nothing we would want to save from the military and the prison when they are destroyed, but there may be much we want to save in the nonprofit and the university. Our task then is to think about how to nurture these elements to prepare them for their lives outside their current institutional forms. Andrea Smith Introduction The Revolution Will Not Be Funded in 2004 INCITE. Women of color against violence learned the hard way that the revolution will not be funded. INCITE began in 2000 with the purpose of supporting a movement of feminists of color organizing against all forms of violence from interpersonal to state violence. When we first organized, we were generally funded through individual donations. However, by 2002, we found ourselves increasingly more successful in securing foundation grants to support our work. We took a stand against state funding since we perceived that anti-violence organizations who had state funding had been co-opted. It never occurred to us to look at foundation funding in the same way. However, in a trip to India, we met with many non-funded organizations that criticized us for receiving foundation grants. When we saw that groups with much less access to resources were able to do amazing work without funding, we began to question our reliance on foundation grants. Our growing suspicions about foundation grants were confirmed when, in February 2004, INCITE received an email from the Ford Foundation with the subject line "Congratulations," and an offer of a 1-year or 2-year grant of $100,000 to cover our general operating expenses in response to a grant proposal the Ford Foundation had solicited from us. Excited about the news, we committed to 2 major projects: the Sister Fire Multimedia Tour, which was organized for 2004, and the Third Color of Violence Conference, to be held in New Orleans in 2005. Then, unexpectedly on July 30th, 2004, the Ford Foundation sent another letter, explaining that it had reversed its decision because of our organization's statement of support for the Palestinian liberation struggle. Apparently, during the board approval process, a board member decided to investigate INCITE further and disapproved of what he found on our website. INCITE quickly learned from first-hand experience the deleterious effects foundations can have on radical social justice movements. However, we also learned that social justice organizations do not always need the foundation support they think they do. Strapped with this sudden loss of funding but committed to organizing 2 major projects, INCITE members started raising money through grassroots fundraising house parties, individual calls, T-shirt sales, and so on, and we were able to quickly raise the money we lost when the Ford Foundation rescinded their grant offer. This story is not an isolated incident of a social justice organization finding itself in a precarious state as a result of foundation funding. Since the late 1970s, social justice organizations within the U.S. have operated largely within the 501 nonprofit model, in which donations made to an organization are tax-deductible, in order to avail themselves of foundation grants. Despite the legacy of grassroots, mass movement building we have inherited from the 1960s and 70s, contemporary activists often experience difficulty developing, or even imagining, structures for organizing outside this model. At the same time, however, social justice organizations across the country are critically rethinking their investment in the 501 system. Funding cuts from foundations affected by the current economic crisis and increased surveillance by the Department of Homeland Security have encouraged social justice organizations to assess opportunities for funding social change that do not rely so heavily upon state structures. The revolution will not be funded. Beyond the nonprofit industrial complex represents a collaborative effort to address these issues and envision new possibilities and models for future organizing. Several key issues are explored. How did the 501, or nonprofit, model develop, and for what reasons? How did this model impact the direction of social justice organizing? How has funding from foundations impacted the course of social justice movements? How does 501 status impact the relationship of social justice organizations to the state and give it opportunities to co-opt movements? Are there ways the nonprofit model can be used to support more radical visions for social change? What alternatives to 501 are there for building viable social justice movements in the U.S.? What models for organizing outside the nonprofit NGO model exist outside the U.S. that may help us? This anthology is not primarily concerned with particular types of nonprofits or foundations, but the nonprofit industrial complex as a whole, and the way in which capitalist interests and the state use nonprofits to monitor and control social justice movements, divert public monies into private hands through foundations, manage and control dissent in order to make the world safe for capitalism, redirect activist energies into career-based modes of organizing instead of mass-based organizing capable of actually transforming society, allow corporations to mask their exploitative and colonial work practices through philanthropic work. One, encourage social movements to model themselves after capitalist structures rather than to challenge them. The revolution will not be funded offers no simple answers to these questions, but hopes to continue a conversation about how to think beyond state-proctored models like the non-profit system for organizing political projects for social change. The contributors are a multi-generational assembly of organizers working inside and outside the NPIC from a variety of even conflicting perspectives. Before assessing these issues, however, we need to understand how the nonprofit system became the predominant model within social movements today. History of the nonprofit system. Prior to the Civil War, individuals, not organizations, did most charity work. However, in the face of accelerating industrialization and accompanying social ills, such as increased poverty, community breakdown to facilitate the flow of labor, and violence, local organizations developed to assist those seen to be deserving of assistance, such as widows and children. These charities focused on individual poverty rather than poverty on the systemic level. Charities did not campaign for higher wages, for instance, but worked to ameliorate the impact of low wages on communities. As this charity movement spread, local charity organizations began to organize on the national level. In 1874, members of private charity organizations, religious agencies, and public officials from several northeastern states established the National Conference of Charities and Corrections to discuss mutual concerns. Point 1 Ding lak have laid Tyen Heralty Del. Our Ramans Regay, so that he's Errol. This system of charitable giving increased exponentially during the early 1900s when the first multi-millionaire robber barons, such as John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and Russell Sage, created new institutions that would exist in perpetuity and support charitable giving in order to shield their earnings from taxation. 2. Before the 1950s, charities were generally unregulated because few states imposed taxes on corporations. Only the largest foundations with the wealthiest donors required charitable deductions. The first such foundation was organized by Margaret Olivia Slocum Sage, who, using the $70 million left to her by railroad giant Russell Sage, started the Russell Sage Foundation in 1907. She was followed by Rockefeller in 1910 and Carnegie in 1911. By 1955, donations from individuals, foundations, and corporations totaled $7 billion, according to the American Association of Fundraising Council Trust for Philanthropy. By 1978, that total had grown to $39 billion. In 1998, the last year of available data, total giving had risen to $175 billion. Along with the growth in donations came a huge swell in the number of nonprofit organizations. In many cases, these foundations served as tax shelters so that corporations could avoid taxes and descendants could receive their inheritance without paying estate taxes. Early on, many of these organizations employed those who had been part of the charity movement, but unlike their charity movement predecessors, these foundations' purviews would be general, rather than specific, and their governance would rely on private, self-perpetuating boards of trustees or directors. From their inception, foundations focused on research and dissemination of information designed ostensibly to ameliorate social issues in a manner, however, that did not challenge capitalism. For instance, in 1913, Colorado miners went on strike against Colorado Fuel and Iron, an enterprise of which 40% was owned by Rockefeller. Eventually, this strike erupted into open warfare, with the Colorado militia murdering several strikers during the Ludlow Massacre of April 20, 1914. During that same time, Jerome Green, the Rockefeller Foundation secretary, identified research and information to quiet social and political unrest as a foundation priority. The rationale behind this strategy was that while individual workers deserve social relief, organized workers in the form of unions were a threat to society. So the Rockefeller Foundation heavily advertised its relief work for individual workers while at the same time promoting a pro-Rockefeller spin to the massacre. For instance, it sponsored speakers to claim that no massacre had happened and tried to block the publication of reports that were critical of Rockefeller. For according to Frederick Gates, who helped run the Rockefeller Foundation, the danger is not the combination of capital, it is not the Mexican situation, it is the labor monopoly, and the danger of the labor monopoly lies in its use of armed force, its organized and deliberate war on society. Tyens filed a report on labor issues with Congress warning that foundations were a grave menace. 6. Because they concentrated wealth and power in the service of ideology which supported the interests of their capitalist benefactors. According to Samuel Gompers's testimony in the Commission's report, in the effort to undertake to be an all-pervading machinery for the molding of the minds of the people, in the constant industrial struggle for human betterment, should be prohibited from exercising their functions, either by law or regulation. 7. The Walsh Report called on Congress to more strictly regulate foundations, which it did not do, given the state's historic relationship with capital. However, the resulting negative publicity encouraged foundations to fund intermediaries, such as universities, rather than doing research themselves, so that the results of such research would be more convincingly objective. 8. During the Great Depression, the societal influence of foundations was curtailed by economic crisis. However, after World War II, particularly with the emergence of the Ford Foundation, foundations regained prominence and focused on how they could further the interests of U.S.-style democracy domestically and abroad. 9. The Ford Foundation became particularly prominent, not only for philanthropic giving, but for its active involvement in trying to engineer social change and shape the development of social justice movements. For instance, foundations, particularly Ford, became involved in the civil rights movement, often steering it into more conservative directions, as the essay from Robert L. Allen in this collection demonstrates. At the same time, however, this civil rights involvement also aroused the ire of the right, particularly in the South, who then called on Congress to more strictly regulate foundations. Right-wing organizations such as the Heritage Foundation claimed that tax dollars were going to subsidize left-wing causes, while on the left, progressives such as Allen were arguing that foundations were pushing social justice movements into more conservative directions. 10. Thus foundations earned critics from all sides. Leading the rights assault on liberal foundations was Congressman Wright Patman of Texas, who conducted a study of foundations, beginning in 1962. In reports he sent to the House of Representatives, Patman contended that economic power was consolidating in the hands of foundations. Foundations were being used to escape estate taxes, compensate relatives, and pay annuities to themselves. The Internal Revenue Service lacked proper oversight over foundations. Foundations were controlling business to give them a competitive advantage over small businesses, and foundations were spending too much of their money overseas. 11. In the early 1960s, Foundations were growing at a rate of 1,200 per year, and financial magazines routinely promoted foundations as tax shelter tools. Point 12. In response, Congress passed the Tax Reform Act of 1969, which reversed the previous state policy of only minimally regulating foundations. This act imposed a 4% excise tax on foundations' net investment income, put restrictions on the ability of foundations to engage in business operations, and required foundatarians to annually spend at least 6% of net investment income to prevent them from growing without serving their ostensible charitable purposes. Additionally, the act required foundations to provide more comprehensive information disclosures on their operations in annual reports to be filed with the IRS and made available to citizens at foundation offices. Notwithstanding its attack on foundations, the right also developed its own foundations. As Michael Schumann of the Institute of Policy Studies notes, while right-wing foundations actually give away less money than liberal foundations, the former use their funds more effectively. Progressive funders generally give money to specific issue-oriented campaigns, whereas right-wing foundations see the need to fund the intellectual projects that enable the right to develop a comprehensive framework for presenting its issues to the public. These think tanks, research projects, journals, etc., may not have had an immediate short-term impact, but in the long run, they altered the public consciousness. This kind of investment by the right in public policy has paid off handsomely. Its long-term support of conservative public scholars enables them to develop and promote numerous new ideas. With ample funding, they have successfully pounded their message into heads of millions, sowing confusion, apathy, and opposition to public regulation of private corporations. Right-wing foundations pour millions of dollars into funding think tanks, such as the Heritage Foundation, to help craft an ideological package that has fundamentally reshaped the consciousness of the public. Heritage Foundation President Edwin Foilner talks about the foresight of right-wing funders such as Richard Scaife, who saw the importance of political education. Right-wing victories, he notes, started more than 20 years ago when Dick Scaife had the vision to see the need for a conservative intellectual movement in America. These organizations built the intellectual case that was necessary before political leaders like Newt Gingrich could translate their ideas into practical political alternatives. 1. The rise of foundation support accompanied the rise of groups that organized as formal 501 nonprofit organizations because foundations could make tax-deductible donations to nonprofits, particularly after the federal government began to regulate foundation giving more strictly in 1969. According to the IRS, nonprofits are religious, charitable, scientific, or educational organizations whose receipts are tax-exempt and whose contributions are tax-deductible for the donors. This tax-exempt status was created by Congress as part of the Revenue Act of 1913, passed after ratification of the 16th Amendment, which instituted the income tax. Generally, organizations must secure 501 status to receive foundation grants, and they are prohibited from direct involvement in political advocacy. In 1953, the IRS estimated that about 50,000 organizations had received charity status. By 1978, that number had risen nearly sixfold. Today, charities number more than 730,000, according to the latest IRS count. As of 1998, there were 734,501 organizations in the United States alone. 16 Today, foundations have assets of $500 billion and give around $33.6 billion annually. 17, and there are 837,027 nonprofits, excluding religious organizations. 18 During the late 1960s, radical movements for social change were transforming the shape of the United States while Third World liberation movements were challenging Western imperialism. Foundations began to take a role in shaping this organizing so that social protest would not challenge the capitalist status quo. Robert L. Allen, as early as 1969, warned of the co-optation of the Black Power movement by foundations. In his germinal work, Black Awakening in Capitalist America, reprinted in part in this anthology, Allen documents how the Ford Foundation's support of certain Black civil rights and Black Power organizations such as CORE actually helped shift the movement's emphasis through the recruitment of key movement leaders from liberation to Black capitalism. Similarly, Madonna Thunderhawk describes how the offer of well-paying jobs in the nonprofit sector seduced many Native activists into diverting their energy from organizing to social service delivery and program development. As Joan Roefels notes in Foundations and Public Policy, large private foundations tended to fund racial justice organizations that focused on policy and legal reform, a strategy that effectively redirected activist efforts from radical change to social reform. It also helped to professionalize these movements, since only those with advanced degrees could do this kind of work, thus minimizing the importance of mass-based grassroots organizing. Waldemar Nielsen, in his 1972 study of the big foundations at the time, noted that funding patterns indicated that philanthropic interest in the Black derives from the long tradition of humanitarian concern for his plight, rather than from an ideological comment to the principle of racial equality. 19. Observing that the majority of foundation funding for racial issues went into higher education, Nielsen notes, have been opened, the primary responsibility for his advancement rests upon the Black man on his own ambition, determination, and effort. 20. So, essentially, foundations provide a cover for white supremacy. Reminiscent of Rockefeller's strategy, people of color deserve individual relief, but people of color organized to end white supremacy become a menace to society. Another strategy developed to sublimate revolutionary movements into reformist ones was leadership training both domestically and internationally, whereby potential organizers were recruited to develop the skills to become policymakers and bureaucrats instead of organizers. 21. As the essay on the NGOization of the Palestinian liberation movement in this volume shows, this strategy of leadership development is still being used to transform liberation struggles. As Howard Dressner, secretary of the Ford Foundation, stated in 1969, American society is being strained at one extreme by those who would destroy what they oppose or do not understand, and at the other by forces that would repress variety and punish dissent. We are in great need of more, not fewer, instruments for necessary social change under law, for ready, informed response to deep-seated problems without chaos, for accommodation of a variety of views without deafening anarchy. Foundations have served as such an instrument. 22. Meanwhile, Robert Arnot's edited volume, Philanthropy and Cultural Imperialism, charged that foundations have a corrosive influence on a democratic society. They represent relatively unregulated and unaccountable concentrations of power and wealth which by talent promote causes and, in effect, establish an agenda of what merits society's attention. They serve as cooling out agencies, delaying and preventing more radical structural change. They help maintain an economic and political order, international in scope, which benefits the ruling class interests of philanthropists. 23. As the essays in this volume will demonstrate, these critiques of foundations and nonprofits still ring true today. What is the nonprofit industrial complex? Dylan Rodriguez defines the nonprofit industrial complex as a set of symbiotic relationships that link political and financial technologies of state and owning class control with surveillance over public political ideology, including and especially emergent progressive and leftist social movements. He and Ruth Wilson Gilmore argue that the NPIC is the natural corollary to the prison industrial complex. While the PIC overtly represses dissent, the NPIC manages and controls dissent by incorporating it into the state apparatus, functioning as a shadow state constituted by a network of institutions that do much of what government agencies are supposed to do with tax money in the areas of education and social services. The NPIC functions as an alibi that allows government to make war, expand punishment, and proliferate market economies under the veil of partnership between the public and private sectors. Christine E. On looks more closely at the role of foundations in particular. She argues that foundations are theoretically a correction for the ills of capitalism. However, if we look at where the actual funding goes, we can see that most of this country's charity, whether individual, corporate, or foundation, is not directed toward programs, services, and institutions that benefit the poor or disenfranchised, and certainly not toward effecting social change. When wealthy people create foundations, they're exempt from paying taxes on their wealth. Thus, foundations essentially rob the public of monies that should be owed to them and give back very little of what is taken in lost taxes. In addition, their funds are derived from profits resulting from the exploitation of labor. That is, corporations become rich by exploiting their workers. Corporate profits are then put into foundations in order to provide relief to workers that are the result of corporate practices in the first place. Rather than thinking of foundations as a source of income for which we should be grateful, On suggests we reimagine them as a target for accountability, just as we might organize to hold corporations or the state accountable to the public good. How then PIC impacts movements? It is easy to critique the larger foundations, but what about smaller foundations without large endowments? Are large foundations the only problem? This question is addressed by Tiffany Lethabo King and Uwero Oseyande's work. While on discusses strategies for holding foundations accountable, King and Oseyande contend that this effort to reform foundations basically serves to protect elitism within social justice movements. They further argue that even self-described alternatives to foundation funding are still based on the same logic that wealthy people should be the donors, and thus, inevitably, the controllers of social justice struggles ultimately. Even these funding strategies disadvantage people of color organizations which do not have the same access to wealthy donors as do white-dominated organizations. Thus, regardless of the intentions of particular foundations, the framework of funding, in which organizations expect to be funded by benefactors rather than by their constituents, negatively impacts social movements as well. Sista 2 Sista and Sisters in Action for Power describe how their respective initial efforts to supervisor become a non-profit ultimately shifted their focus from organizing to corporate management. When Sisters in Action for Power realized the detrimental impact the NPIC had on its work, it began to explore how its organization could reject this corporate model and instead develop structures that more closely model the vision of the society it is trying to build. This step necessitated the development of organizing strategies within an integrated mind-body-spirit framework that respects organizing processes as much as outcomes. Aware that such approaches are often antithetical to foundations' requirements that focus on short-term campaign outcomes, Sisters in Action for Power explains why it nonetheless chose to engage in campaigns to develop leadership in young women of color through a holistic framework. Madonna Thunderhawk reminds us that many radical movements for change are able to accomplish much if not more outside the nonprofit system. Her essay discusses her involvement with Women of All Red Nations, which did incredible work without a single foundation grant. Mindful that many contemporary activists feel they cannot do their work without starting a nonprofit first, Thunderhawk also observes that foundations only give money to more well-established NGOs who have the expertise. But more often than not, she warns, these purported experts are generally not part of the communities they advocate for and hence do not contribute to building grassroots leadership, particularly in indigenous communities. In this way, the NPIC contributes to a mode of organizing that is ultimately unsustainable. To radically change society, we must build mass movements that can topple systems of domination, such as capitalism. However, the NPIC encourages us to think of social justice organizing as a career, that is, you do the work if you can get paid for it. However, a mass movement requires the involvement of millions of people, most of whom cannot get paid. By trying to do grassroots organizing through this careerist model, we are essentially asking a few people to work more than full-time to make up for the work that needs to be done by millions. In addition, the NPIC promotes a social movement culture that is non-collaborative, narrowly focused, and competitive. To retain the support of benefactors, groups must compete with each other for funding by promoting only their own work, whether or not their organizing strategies are successful. This culture prevents activists from having collaborative dialogues where we can honestly share our failures as well as our successes. In addition, after being forced to frame everything we do as a success, we become stuck in having to repeat the same strategies because we insisted to funders they were successful, even if they were not. Consequently, we become inflexible rather than fluid and ever-changing in our strategies, which is what a movement for social transformation really requires. And as we become more concerned with attracting funders than with organizing mass-based movements, we start niche marketing the work of our organizations. Framing our organization's key TELO introduction, 11 as working on a particular issue or a particular strategy, we lose perspective on the larger goals of our work. Thus, niche marketing encourages us to build a fractured movement rather than mass-based movements for social change. Project South suggests that a fatal error made by many activists is presuming that one needs money to organize. While fundraising is part of organizing, fundraising is not a precondition for organizing. Project South describes how they integrate fundraising into organizing so that those who fulfill fundraising positions in Project South are trained organizers, not fundraisers. Ana Clarissa Rojas Durazo, Elisa Bayeria, and Paul Kivel trace the impact of the NPIC on the anti-violence movement. Rojas notes that the anti-violence movement became co-opted by the state through federal and state funding. Her work builds on the analysis of Suzanne Farr, who notes that the move toward developing anti-violence organizations through the non-profit system coincided with Reaganomics. At the same time that Reagan was slashing government services, the women's movement organized itself into non-profits to provide the services the government was no longer providing. Consequently, the anti-violence movement essentially became a surrogate for the state. 24 Likewise, Bayeria observes an anti-violence movement focused less on grassroots organizing and more on professionalization and social service delivery as a direct result of increased government and foundation funding. Instead of imagining domestic violence survivors who could organize on their own behalf, anti-violence organizations viewed them only as clients in need of services. Kivel argues that the NPIC assigns social service professionals a particular function within the capitalist system of managing dissent. Still, he does not suggest that there should be no social services agencies at all, rather, that social service agencies should also engage social justice organizing or must be accountable to social movements if they are to further, rather than impede, social justice. The impact of the NPIC on the anti-violence movement has been particularly disastrous because most of the government funding it receives has been through the Department of Justice, especially with the advent of the Violence Against Women Act. As a result, anti-violence organizations have focused primarily on criminal justice solutions to ending violence that reinforce the prison industrial complex. In fact, many anti-violence organizations are now located within police departments. Women of color, who must address both gender violence within their communities and state violence against their communities, have been particularly impacted by the direction the mainstream anti-violence movement has taken. This NGOization of the anti-violence movement is also actively exported to other countries, following a model Gayatri Spivak calls Saving Brown Women from Brown Men 25, which tends to pathologize communities in the Third World for their backward attitudes toward women. The goal becomes to save third LGG0 HPEYNE0 TT31S1S6 world women from the extreme patriarchy in their community, without looking at how patriarchy is connected to white supremacy and colonialism. Thus, for instance, mainstream feminist groups will support the bombing in Afghanistan to save Afghan women from the Taliban, as if U.S. empire actually liberates women. Women of color have also been particularly impacted by the role of foundations in the women's health and reproductive justice movements. Foundations have been active in supporting the population control movement, which blames the reproductive capabilities of women of color and third world women for almost all social ills, including poverty, war, and environmental destruction. For instance, John D. Rockefeller III founded the Population Council in 1952 to foster international population control policies under the notion that overpopulation causes unrest and hence revolution. 26. The Population Council supported mass population control efforts in Latin America during the 1960s and 1970s. 27. And in the last 6 months of 1976, the Population Council supported the sterilization of 6.5 million people in India through the use of police raids to round up men and women, with thousands dying from infections caused by the unsanitary conditions under which the sterilizations were performed. In one village alone, all the young men were sterilized. 28. Today, what Betsy Hartman terms the population establishment, 29, spends billions of dollars each year on population programs, policy setting, and education. Certainly, third world women of color want family planning services, but many of the programs foisted upon them have been implemented without concern for their health. For instance, before Narplant was introduced in the U.S., the Population Council inserted it into nearly 500,000 women in Indonesia, often without providing counseling on side effects and without telling them that there had been no long-term studies on the drug's effects. Many were not told that it needed to be removed after 5 years to avoid an increased risk of ectopic pregnancy. 3,500 women in India were implanted with Norplant 2 in trials that began in the 1980s, without being warned about possible side effects or screened to determine if they were suitable candidates. These programs were finally discontinued due to concerns about teratogenicity and carcinogenicity. In both cases, women who wanted the implant removed had great difficulty finding doctors who could do so. 31. The 1994 Cairo Conference on Population and Development. 32 Population control is one of Pew's top priorities. Organized through the Global Stewardship Initiative, it targets our environmental organizations, domestic affairs and foreign policy initiatives, and religious organizations. 33 In conjunction with the Park Ridge Center, in February 1994, Pew organized a forum in Chicago on religious perspectives on population, consumption, and the environment. In May 1994, it hosted a consultation that brought together thinkers from major world religions to deliberate on population issues, 34 issuing a statement to contradict the Vatican's anti-choice position. 35 As a lead-in to the Cairo Conference, Pew targeted churches to support a Cairo consensus on population by organizing focus groups with different constituencies, including various religious groups. It identified the problem constituencies as those who accept overpopulation as a problem in terms of unequal distribution of resources and mismanagement of resources, not numbers of people. 36 Pew then targeted the elites of religious communities who would understand its construction of the problems of overpopulation. 37 Its efforts met with success. In 1993, a Pew survey of 30 U.S. denominations found that 43% had an official statement on population. 38 church leaders in both evangelical and liberal denominations came out in support of the Cairo Conference, lauding its steps forward on women's reproductive health issues. Through this work, Pew had, in the words of Hartman, managed to manufacture consensus over the Cairo Conference. 39 Through its vast financial resources, Pew has been able to change the agenda of environmental organizations and programs in order to suit its own vision for the world. 40 Nonprofits and global organizing globally. Both foundations and nonprofits (NGOs) have received widespread criticism for their implicit or explicit support of first world interests and free market capitalism. Numerous foundations and nonprofits have directly colluded with the Central Intelligence Agency. For instance, foundations have supported and continue to support CIA programs and educational exchanges with East Africa and Eastern Europe to maintain a U.S. presence in these areas without the consent of Congress. 41 The CIA also employs political scientists and collaborates with professors in sponsoring university institutes. These institutes were created on the advice of foundations that assume scholars would be more likely to cooperate with intelligence work if it were done in an academic location. These scholars also helped recruit potential allies among foreign students. 42 Additionally, the CIA directed funding through foundations to support cultural arts to recruit leftist cultural workers and showcase U.S. cultural achievements globally. Since the State Department could not fund such activities directly, they had to be funneled through foundations. 43 Gerald Colby and Charlotte Dennett's book, That Will Be Done, also charges that John D. Rockefeller III funded missionary agencies that collaborated with the CIA for several decades in Latin America. These missionaries' agents would befriend indigenous peoples in Latin America, collaborate with them to translate the Bible into indigenous languages, and then use these intermediaries to funnel intelligence information to the CIA to facilitate resource extraction and destabilize leftist regimes. 44 Critics further charge that the Ford Foundation funded programs to revitalize Indian religions in India to counter the spread of communism. This tactic has the impact of defusing opposition from a leftist framework, but also fuels religious fundamentalism and the rise of Hindu right nationalism. 45 Foundations have also been directly involved in squelching revolutionary movements in the Third World. The Ford Foundation was actively involved through its various programs in diverting the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa from an anti-capitalist to a pro-capitalist movement. 46 Cyril Ramaphosa, a Secretary-General of the African National Congress who led a 1987 miners' strike praised by the Ford Foundation. 47 Signed a $900 million contract with Anglo American, a corporation that accounts for 25% of South Africa's gross domestic product and controls much of South Africa's gold and diamond mining. The goal of this collaboration is to bring blacks into the mainstream economy, rather than to challenge the economic status quo. 48 is demonstrated in the NGOization of the Palestine Liberation Movement, a series of interviews with 4 longtime activists. These same strategies are being used by NGOs to de-radicalize the struggle in Palestine. James Petras makes some similar arguments in his 1994 essay NGOs, In the Service of Imperialism. Petras notes that despite claiming to be non-governmental organizations, they actually support government interests. NGOs, he writes, receive funds from overseas governments, work as private subcontractors of local governments, and/or are subsidized by corporate-funded private foundations with close working relations with the state. Their programs are not accountable to local people, but to overseas donors who review and oversee the performance of the NGOs according to their criteria and interests. The NGO officials are self-appointed, and one of their key tasks is designing proposals that will secure funding. In many cases, this requires that NGO leaders find out the issues the Western funding elites fund, and shape proposals accordingly. Point 49, for example. He notes that NGOs direct organizing efforts away from dealing with exploitation by the World Bank to supporting microcredit projects that place the solution to poverty on individual initiative rather than changing global economic systems. He adamantly opposes even progressive NGOs, arguing that they divert resources from the people, they subordinate movement leadership to NGO leadership, and they do not put their lives on the lines. Progressive NGOs use peasants and the poor for their research projects. They benefit from the publication. Nothing comes back to the movements, not even copies of the studies done in their names. Moreover, peasant leaders ask why the NGOs never risk their neck after their educational seminars. Why do they not study the rich and powerful? Why us, the NGOs, should stop being NGOs and convert themselves into members of socio-political movements. The fundamental question is whether a new generation of organic intellectuals can emerge from the burgeoning radical social movements, which can avoid the NGO temptation and become integral members of the next revolutionary wave. Point 50. Reformulating the role of nonprofits in contrast to Petras. Contributors Ajoa Florencia, Jones de Almeida, and Paula X. Rojas suggest alternative possibilities for understanding the proper relationship between nonprofits and social movements as informed by the role of nonprofits in mass movements in other countries. Jones de Almeida and Rojas point out that in many countries, social movements are not necessarily dominated by nonprofits. Instead, movement building is funded and determined by the constituents. These movements may make strategic alliances with nonprofits or develop their own nonprofits as intermediaries to fund specific aspects of their work. But a key difference is that these nonprofits are accountable to social movements. They are not seen as part of the movement themselves. Furthermore, the goal is to sustain movements, not nonprofits that support movements. Within the U.S., Ruth Wilson Gilmore suggests that many organizations can be effective even with 501 status if they have a clear mission and purpose and if they are funded by their constituents. She further suggests it is central to remember that our focus should not be on organizational preservation, but on furthering the movement of which an organization is a part. Eric Tang also concludes that while nonprofits can have a role to support the movement, they cannot be an end unto themselves. He argues that the revolution will not be funded. We must create autonomous movements. But once we develop that mass movement, nonprofits could serve as buffers that protect autonomous movements from government repression. Most of the essays in this anthology were presented in 2004 at The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, Beyond the Nonprofit Industrial Complex, a conference organized by INCITE, Women of Color Against Violence, co-organized by the Women of Color Collective of the University of California, Santa Barbara. This historic international gathering provided an opportunity for activists SDS LA 16. The revolution will not be funded and organizers to share their struggles of organizing within the context of the nonprofit system. While providing no simple answers, it did encourage a conversation on new ways to think about organizing and activism. These essays do not necessarily represent the views of INCITE, and they do not necessarily agree with one another. Nevertheless, they provide a space for social justice organizers and activists to begin thinking of ways to build movements that either do not rely primarily on the nonprofit model or position themselves differently within the system. We hope it will continue a conversation that may move us forward in developing new strategies for revolutionary work. Preface. Andrea